Hunters, what did you see out there that made you not want to go back into the woods? My father and I were following a trail for a while, so we decided to take a break and catch our breaths. I sat on a log off the trail, and my dad stood on the edge of the trail waiting for me to get up. I heard some movement and scan around, and I see a man dressed casually walking quickly down the trail with a Glock in his hand. He's not really following the trail, he's just walking toward my dad with haste. Before he comes up to my dad, he asks if he's seen anything. Pretty normal. I keep an eye on him because I don't believe he was out there to hunt. I was thinking he was there to make sure my dad hadn't seen anything he wasn't supposed to. He wasn't dressed like a hunter, he didn't walk like a hunter, and it was deer season, and he decided he would take his Glock out to get a deer. I wasn't buying it, so I put a round in the chamber and watched them talk. He seemed to be confident until my dad mentioned that he was here with me and gestured in my direction. I nodded and made a half-butted wave, and he seemed to lose interest in us and ended the conversation shortly after and turned around and walked back the way he came, just about as fast as he walked up to us. It worried us a bit, but we continued on. We haven't been back to that area in a while. My dad told me that there have been drug busts near that area in the past. This isn't a supernatural tale, just an experience that made me not want to go back to that area. A long time ago, my grandparents bought a small cabin in the woods in Pennsylvania. My dad, uncle, and aunts are all small children. My father told me this story. They're all sitting around outside with a small fire going when they hear branches breaking and footsteps coming from the darkness. They think it's a black bear because it's close, but they can't see it. It seems to be going straight for my uncle, the littlest of the children. He starts panicking while everyone tells him not to move. Now this big black beast is within arm's reach of him and he's shaking like a leaf with his eyes closed. All of a sudden, it opens its jaws and starts licking his face. It turns out that the next property over is owned by a couple who raise Newfoundland dogs, and one got out. I know these stories about scary giant beasts turning out to be just big, lovable dogs are a little overdone at this point, but I will always read and love them. I love dogs, and frankly, I'm pretty sure the rest of this thread won't be so sweet. My family owns a couple of 100 acres of forest in eastern North Carolina. No one lives on the property anymore and hasn't for the last 6 or 7 years. We went down there to do some target shooting in October of 2017, and I decided to go walk through the outskirts of the woods to locate a good limb for our range marker. As I'm walking, literally and proverbially kicking rocks, I come across a fairly nice but practically brand new looking suitcase full of clothes and other personal effects. No ID, nothing with any sort of identifying markers on them, but seemed to be clothes for 4 people. 2 kids and 2 adults, 1 male and 1 female. Had some food, coloring books, etc. There was a makeshift lean-to about 100 yards farther into the woods. Set up a trail camera and left it there for 3 weeks, never saw anyone. For reference, this is 35 miles from any sizable town or city. I've got a good one. I have a hunting spot that I frequent. Not crazy far off the grid or anything like that. The terrain is a pain in the butt, but it's a pretty hidden spot that is close to my house. Anyway, I hunt a lot of small game there and see a ton of mule deer anytime I go out. One morning I get there about 5:30 a.m. and have some time to kill before I start my hike. I have an odd feeling in the parking lot, but just chalk it up to too much coffee on an empty stomach giving me anxiety. So I decided to start hiking in, and about 300 yards into my hike, I noticed this pile of downed trees, branches, general debris that I hadn't seen before. It was my first time hunting this particular place this particular season, so I figure some folks came out and did some fire mitigation work. I don't pay too much attention to it until I notice there's an odd amount of movement coming from it. Pretty small movements, but it sticks out when a brush pile is wiggling on a still day. It was also about 5:45 a.m. and the wilderness just sort of has this stillness to it at that time that any movement is noticeable. So I stop and start examining the pile to figure out what's going on. I figure there's a rabbit in there, maybe some squirrels. I figure I've hit the jackpot and I'm definitely about to bag something. I start deciding the best way to flush whatever is going on in there and still have my shotgun up in time to take a good shot. I realize I'm standing by a decent-sized branch and my best move is to just stomp on the branch. If all goes according to plan, everything will freeze, then whatever's in there will dart out. I try to figure out where the rabbit will come out of, get ready, and bam! I step on the branch and snap it in half. The pile goes still, and that stillness and quiet is back. Then, A mountain lion with a bloody nose and mouth pops out of the pile. At this point, I'm about 10 yards from the pile. I have my shotgun but really don't want to shoot the lion. I also don't want to fire a shot off in the air to scare it because all in all, that was a pretty cool experience that very few people get to have. It froze and was looking at me very quizzically. Then, in one quick motion, it hopped out of the brush pile, ran uphill, got about 40 yards from me, and disappeared into the trees. I've never seen something cover 40 yards uphill in such a fast, graceful way. One of the coolest things I've ever gotten to experience. I went to check out the brush pile when it left, and sure enough, it was feasting on a mule deer. Still my favorite out in the woods story I ever tell. I love how for most people this story would, as the prompt suggests, be scared to death if this happened. However, our OP is just like, wow, this is awesome. Honestly, sounds like a pretty amazing experience. I work in the woods for a living, and I've seen a fair amount of odd things. Carvings in trees, old beat-up cars, random weird trash scattered through the woods, and a fair amount of animal carcasses. I've had instances where I've gotten spooked. Stuff like jumping big critters is always quite jolting, but I can recall one rather butt-puckering experience. I was working with a few other people at the time, spaced out of sight but not out of earshot. I crossed over a little ridge at least 2 miles from the closest road in the middle of the woods, and I saw what looked like a full skeleton of a cow tied together with twigs and a little bit of twine. Whoever made it had fashioned it to be sitting on a log. They left a very neat pile of bones in front of the thing and nothing anywhere else. I saw it and about fainted. Definitely really effing odd considering how far we were off the road and how thick and steep it was. I ended up getting the folks I was with to come to check it out, really just for craps and giggles. I took note of it and we moved on to the next plots. I have a picture, but I'm new to this whole thing, so I'll try to figure out how to upload it. There's a place in Kingston, Idaho, or the other side of Fern and Saddle, depending on which way you go to get there. I call it the Snake Pit, and no, I don't mean the restaurant. I still visit the area now once in a while and camp there. Anyways, next to where I camp in the trees is a basin, and it has a bunch of old 1920s to 1930s rotted cars in it, overgrown by bushes and trees, but sunlight falls on the cars. The first time I camped out there, I walked into those woods and the leaves all started to move. The snakes were running from me while they were sunbathing on the cars. Effing creeped me out. I don't go in there for wood anymore, and I don't see the snakes leave that spot, so I just let them be. When I was a kid, a poacher must have thought I was a deer or something and shot around at me. It impacted on a tree above my head. I immediately fired 3 shots as fast as I could, not at the shooter, but in the air. In my hunting group, immediate 3 shots means help, basically. My dad and our hunting club immediately came to find out what the F happened by honking the horns of their trucks, letting me know they were coming. I basically laid on the ground until I could tell they were near the dirt road. Told them what happened and guessed it was probably a road poacher trying to get a deer as it came from the same road. They didn't see him, it was private property, and we were always very aware of who was at what location and who was hunting where. Nobody was supposed to be in the part I was at. Scared the crap out of me. This was in the mid-90s. The reason why I don't like hunting on public property is because of that, and I don't know the people out there. Not a hunter, but I go backpacking and fishing quite a bit. I have an irrational fear of bears, and waking up to bear tracks around my camp was quite unsettling, and I did not spend much more time in the area. I've also had a creepy encounter with an overly friendly deer. It was in a pretty isolated area, so I thought it was odd to see a deer that was so calm around humans. This deer would not leave me alone. It walked around my camp all day and came back at night to scare the crap out of me by laying down outside my tent. So, when I was in my early to late teens, my family had a deer farm. Yes, a deer farm. And while on that farm helping out, an adolescent deer once bit my finger, drew blood, and then was all over me. After that, all of the deer would always gather around the fence whenever I was outside and just follow me in a way they didn't seem to do with anyone else. All I'm saying is deer are bloodthirsty monsters and you're lucky to be alive. Camping alone in the middle of Missouri the night before turkey hunting. The place I found was a fairly well-used campsite, but no one was there. About to go to sleep when I heard a truck come up. I find a reason to come out, use the restroom so I can get a look and maybe even ask for some good places to spot turkey. It's a dude and his girlfriend drinking beers and going for a ride. They're super nice, but they mentioned after our chat and before leaving, watch yourself out here. Lots of M-heads and they won't stop for birdshot. Want a slug? I probably have a few in my toolkit. I did not sleep at all that night. I do a lot of hiking and mountain biking in the woods. Nothing has ever made me not want to go back, but there has been some weird crap. First, there's just a lot of weird stuff in the woods. Teepees, altars, lean-tos, shrines, etc. Some of it's pretty creepy, but I think most of it is just built by bored people who are trying to make something creepy, so that makes it a bit less scary. Amongst the strangest of these things that I've seen are a large clearing of trees with all but one entrance blocked off by webs of red strings, and a giant stone pentagram stretched across the clearing, about 30 feet diameter. A wooden tunnel leading to a small room containing defaced religious icons, Buddha statues, crucifixes, Star of David, etc. And dozens/hundreds of creepy Polaroid pictures hanging from the ceiling. Ones I remember include a close-up face shot of a girl sleeping, a dude brushing his teeth taken from outside of the window, and a photo booth strip of two girls where one of their faces are crossed out and "I'm glad you're dead" written with one word on each picture, and a number of weird little shrines with creepy scriptures printed or scrawled into them. But what's a lot scarier to me is stuff that isn't meant to be creepy, like the aforementioned things hopefully are. I once heard a distant panicked scream followed by a crashing/thudding sound. I couldn't tell from which direction it came, and I didn't hear anything else, so I have no idea what it was. I think the creepiest thing I've experienced was one time while walking home from school through the woods. I heard people talking in the distance and I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they seemed to be arguing. They were quiet for a minute and then I heard them again, really close now. The forest was really dense here, so although they sounded maybe 15 to 20 feet away, I couldn't see them or pinpoint exactly where they were. This time, I could hear what they said. Guy 1, "It's effed up you guys always make me." Guy 2 in a hushed voice, "Shh, someone's coming." Guy 3 from a bit further to my left than the other guys, who sounded to be mostly right in front of me, "Hurry." I came around a corner and expected to see them, but I couldn't see anyone. I kept walking, cautious and trying to be aware of my surroundings. About 10 feet past the corner, I saw something to the left of the trail close to where the voices were coming from that caught my eye. It was a bunch of stuff wrapped up in a big tarp. It wasn't completely wrapped up and you could kind of see into it. All I could see was something glass and I wanted to see what it was. I scanned the forest behind the tarp to make sure nobody was watching and then stepped towards it. Suddenly, one of them says, "Keep walking," very calmly. I looked back into the forest but couldn't see anyone. They said, "Go," still calm. I looked for another second, still unable to see a soul, and then turned and kept walking as nothing had happened. I don't know what was going on, but the whole thing gave me the creepiest vibe I've ever gotten. Went on a camping trip maybe 10 years ago, and in the middle of the night we heard this incredibly loud smack way out on the water. Water carries sound really well, so it woke us all right the F up. My first thought was some drunk/deranged mother effer with a gun was shooting out over the lake and the sound was a bullet skimming off the surface. Turns out it was a beaver that smacked the crap out of the water before diving under. It happened again in the early morning and we laughed it off, but the notion of being out in the middle of nowhere with some homicidal prick taking pot shots at you creeped me out pretty good. So far, when it comes to actually being scared of something in the woods, it is rarely nature or the supernatural that you should be scared of, but other people. There's a really trite lesson somewhere in this video about man being the real monster, but I think we all already knew that. I used to be a field appraiser, you might call it assessor where you live, for a country in rural Kansas. I was at a parcel looking at and data collecting some 20-foot shipping containers that had appeared in the last several months. It was obvious they were being used as hunting cabins during hunting season. As I was finishing up, I turned around to walk back to my vehicle, and standing right there were two hunters. They were dressed head to toe like snipers with ghillie suits on, with large caliber rifles pointed at me. That scared the heck out of me. Of course, they were mouthy and peed off towards me. Then, when they found out what I was doing, that escalated things even more. I don't blame them really. They saw me walking around, looking and measuring everything and taking photos of the place. I spend a lot of time in the backcountry in the wintertime. Usually it's just me and a friend. Most trails we do are popular in the summer and totally dead once it starts to snow. Winter is 2014. We've hiked about 2 miles in and see this small black backpack in the middle of the trail. We hadn't seen any other cars at the trailhead or any people around, but this backpack hadn't been there long because there wasn't any snow on it. It had snowed the night before. It was a very odd sight. We figured if it was still on the trail when we looped around, we'd pick it up. About 4 miles in, and my friend and I are chatting away when I notice a large figure flailing in some trees up ahead. We go quiet and can hear this man rambling while he's pacing. At this point, we're pretty freaked out and decide to turn around when we hear, "Oh, hi there!" And this guy starts walking towards us. And then out pops another guy with a very pricey-looking video camera. It turns out this flailing guy was actually a rapper, and they were filming a music video for one of his new songs out in the forest. They had parked before the trailhead, so we didn't notice their car. They ended up being super friendly and gave us a card, and we figured out it was their backpack we had seen on the trail the few miles before. We said our goodbyes and walked out, but hot damn, I was sure we were about to be killed in the woods. Of all the possible outcomes I expected when they came across someone crazily flailing in the woods, rapper didn't even make it onto my list of possibilities. The forest really is full of the unknown. I missed this trip with my dad and his hunting buddy. They were in a remote section of southeastern Wyoming hunting for elk. Like any good elk hunter, they were up at 3:30 to stake out their spot and watch the herd patterns before daylight. As they were driving up to the spot, a figure appeared in their headlights, and by their silhouette, it wasn't a hunter. What was a person doing walking down the road in complete darkness with no hunting gear? My dad was driving, so he slowed to a crawl in his truck, and his buddy prepared his sidearm, as this had foul play written all over it. When they could distinguish the figure in the headlights, they saw it was a girl in a tank top and underwear wearing no shoes. They stopped and verbally checked her status out the window, as there could have easily been somebody staked out in the sagebrush ready to ambush. When it was clear she was severely hypothermic and bleeding from her feet, they got out and let her into the truck cab. From there, it had to have been a terrifying experience for that girl. I sure wouldn't want two middle-aged rednecks picking me up 40 miles from any town. They cranked up the full heat blast and drove her to a nearby country gas station where they were regular customers and friends with the owner and his wife, who was a retired nurse. When the girl could finally articulate her words, she told them she and her boyfriend drove out there to drink and have intercourse. When she started having a seizure during intercourse, he lost his temper, grabbed her shoes, and threw them into the sage. When she got out of the car to find them, he peeled off, leaving her in near-freezing temperatures in her skivvies. She estimated she walked about 4 miles on a dirt road before my dad found her. It's a good thing hunters start early because she could easily have died. My dad's story, not mine. I'd been walking for a couple hours and I decided to sit under a tree for a while just to see what would happen. As I was relaxing, I noticed this light that kept flashing past my eyes. I looked over to where it was coming from, but I couldn't see what was there. Then I looked down and there was a red dot on my chest. Some a-hole was using a laser sight and aiming at me. I yelled at him and started walking towards him, but he ran off. I went back to camp for the rest of the day. He didn't think someone was actually trying to shoot him, but if people aren't going to be safe with their rifles, he didn't want to be out there. Yeah, I'm sorry, but if someone points a gun at me with a laser sight, that's pretty much it for me for the day. I'm gonna pack it in and go wash my underwear, thank you very much. Not a hunter, but a herper. I was looking for amphibians and reptiles with a few classmates at a local park during our herpetology class last summer when we came across 2 little wooden teepees and a card table covered in animal bones. It looked like we walked right into the Blair Witch Project. Each of the structures had little altars that contained more bones in jars, plants, and other weird little trinkets. We got out of there fast and told the volunteer coordinator we were working with. We found out a while later that apparently some homeschooled kids nearby like to play in the woods, and they had most likely collected the things we saw. I understand making forts in the woods, but the structures these kids made were freaky as F. When I was younger, I used to horseback around Northern California for weeks at a time. This was during the late 70s, early 80s. I rarely used a compass, but I always had a map of the area. I'm pretty good at dead reckoning via landmarks, and I've never been lost in my life except once. I was in the Six Rivers National Forest heading south toward Trinity County. This is very rough terrain, lots of high ridges, steep hills, rocks everywhere, and nasty brush to tangle you. I was riding the ridges heading generally south and trying to find easy places to cross to the next ridge when it became convenient. The skies were partly cloudy and it was cool, about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold for that time of year since it was early August and the temps were normally 90+ degrees Fahrenheit during the day. I found a reasonable spot to cross over to the next ridge south of me and started down. When I got into the ravine, it turned out what looked easy from above was actually a rocky nightmare. I started walking up the ravine to find an easier place to get out of there. A wind picked up and it started drizzling. I walked for a mile or so, couldn't find anything that I wanted to risk my neck on, and more importantly, my horse's hooves, and decided to start up the side I had come down originally. I got to the top, took a look around to orient myself, and froze in shock. The landscape was completely different. I don't mean that it was lower or easier or less rocky. I mean that all of my landmarks were gone. Some of them were peaks that were 30 to 40 miles away, others were a lot closer. It was completely different. I had no idea where I was, and I was completely disoriented. I dug out my map and started to review where I was, the angles on the hills I had been navigating by earlier, etc. I couldn't find anything that matched. The only thing that I could positively identify was the route up from the ravine that I had just come up. Since it was cloudy, I couldn't navigate by the sun. All I had were the landmarks that I used for Dead Reckoning, and those were gone. The wind was picking up and it was getting very, very cold. I almost expected snow. I had no idea where I was, so I decided to backtrack to my last known position and see if I could pick up where I left off. I started down the hill, got to the bottom of the ravine, and started the opposite direction up the ravine. This time I was very careful, watching for signs of my passage before and the hill I came down in the first place. It stopped raining, the wind died down, and the day started to warm up. I found my original trail down the hill, started back up, and got to the top. All the landmarks were there now. I was totally confused. I kept going on the ridge, watching carefully to find where I had come up before. When I got to the spot where I thought it should be, there was no sign of it. I cast back and forth for a while, trying to find my trail with no success. All of my landmarks were there to see. Eventually, I gave up and continued on the ridge. A bit later, I found an easy trail down and an easy trail back up to the other side and continued on my way. To this day, I have no idea what happened. Even though it was drizzling, I should have been able to see the closer landmarks, and honestly, the further landmarks were big enough to see. To that point, thinking back on it, there was no sign that it was drizzling when I continued on to where I had ascended the first time. And the temperature swings were wild that day, easily 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Not uncommon in the mountains, but really odd for that time of year in that place. Another thing, originally I had chosen to descend that at the point because there was nothing to prevent me from going up the other side. I could easily see from the ridgetop, but when I arrived, there were tons of boulders blocking me that I should have been able to see from the top. Eerie and creepy. At the time, sure, but I was more focused on trying to orient myself, but thinking back on it, even more so now. I love that what was a really weird, frightening incident for this person is something that would have been completely normal for me. This guy experiences a lack of orientation for the first time in his life, and he's all worried and confused. Meanwhile, I can barely walk across my kitchen without completely losing my sense of direction. A couple of years ago, I was in northern British Columbia on a fishing trip with my dad, uncle, and cousins. The lake and river was a 2-hour drive from the nearest city. We were drifting down the river when I needed to go to the bathroom, so I got out of the boat. As I'm doing my business, I look over and see what seems to be the top of a building. I turned to the people in the boat and told them what I saw. Walked toward the building and realized it wasn't alone. Multiple homes, buildings in the middle of the forest. It was a very small and isolated Native American tribe, and we backed away. Not super creepy, but didn't want to cause any trouble. We continued on without any contact. I've seen a lot of the usual stuff out in northwestern Canada, but the only thing that made me really think twice about going into the woods out there was not wanting to find a body. There are dozens, hundreds of unsolved missing persons cases out there, many of them Indigenous women, but some men and white people as well. There are signs up everywhere with information about the missing. I hope they're found and their families find some closure, but I dreaded being the one to come across the corpse. The other thing that made me think twice was the bullet holes everywhere. Blowing holes in the highway signs is bad, but these F-heads would shoot up outhouses. Nothing like taking a dump and counting the bullet holes in front of your face. Canada has some stricter gun laws than the States, but people still make bad decisions. So nothing really spooky, just people. My dad's childhood friend was killed in a hunting accident. He was shot right out of his tree stand on state land. This was back in the late 1980s when I was young. Nobody ever turned themselves in, and I doubt from the angle/caliber that they ever even found the bullet. To this day, his murder is unsolved. After that, my mom forbade my dad to go hunting, and by extension, me. I hear too many stories of people getting pee-drunk and doing stupid things with guns in the woods anyway. I'm lucky enough now to own 10 acres of property where I can take a deer just about every year with a shotgun, but I don't think I will ever hunt on state land. So, I have two stories. First, the not-so-creepy one. I was about 20 miles out in the backcountry on a week-long hunting trip by myself. Woke up in the middle of the night to a bear sticking its snout into the fabric of my tent. I immediately started meditating to slow my breath and just weather the situation, because I knew if I moved or made a run for my car, I'd be dead. The next morning, I found some paw prints, and they were the biggest bear prints I've ever seen. Second, very creepy story. Was deep in the woods this time too. Set up camp in a very nice little ravine. When I woke up, there was a ring of big rocks around my camping area. They weren't there when I got there / set up camp. I'm also a stout dude, and I couldn't move any of the rocks. I was raised in the woods, and now I refuse to go out there without a large caliber gun, and I refuse to sleep out in the woods anymore. This might be one of the only supernatural adjacent stories in this whole thread, and despite it just being rocks, that is really eerie. This sounds like some kind of Appalachian folklore stuff, and I don't mess with that. There's a place near where I come from that has all the hallmarks of an excellent hunting area. Nobody goes there because there's a stand of giant Douglas fir trees that are at least 300 years old. And there are boots hanging by their laces, dozens of pairs all hung in the very top branches of the trees. It's practically impossible for a human being to have done this, and nobody has a reasonable explanation for it. Even the most seasoned hunters will tell you to stay the hell away from there. After helping my dad and brother quarter a big bull elk in the middle of nowhere, I went up the hill first because I had the lightest load. I figured I'd get my quarters to the top and then go back down and help my dad with the chest cavity. It had just stopped snowing, and when I was resting at the top of the hill, I glanced down and saw paw prints in the snow that had no snow in them. I knew based on the size it was either a wolf or mountain lion, but after looking closer I realized I just saw pads on the foot and not nails / claws making a mark in the front of the print. This meant I was definitely looking at the tracks of a big mountain lion who had been 50 yards from us as we worked on the elk. My dad was at the bottom of the hill. I had a front quarter on my back and a hind quarter on the sled I was pulling behind me and no gun. I knew it was just the three of us and I'd be around my dad the whole time who was armed, so I didn't bring an additional firearm. I was a walking buffet standing right where the cat had been a few minutes before, so there's no question he was looking at me. I calmly set the quarters down and made my way down to my dad. He agreed that I should have done what I did and even joked about it, saying, "At least our load won't be as heavy when we get back up there. I bet he took the front quarter." We got back up the hill, and my quarters had been untouched with no additional cat tracks around it. All three of us were paranoid as hell walking back the 2 miles to the truck, not knowing if at any moment the cat might decide he was hungry. We made it back home just fine and laughed about the whole thing as we were cleaning and butchering the elk. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.